All right. So today is what is today? The January 26th, and it is our third, yes, third study on the Got Questions study. And we've already been talking, sorry for you folks that are just now watching this, but we've been talking about the genealogies and how interesting the how the two different genealogies differed. And Marley, you were saying about how you were looking up in your own family tree. And you're
Right.
right, it is very difficult to get to even find records that would take you back. And so in that way, of course, what we have in the Bible is really significant, right? Um, Even though, as we learned during Advent, we talked about how there were generations that were left out because Matthew wanted each of those groupings to be 14 generations,
Yeah.
and that had to do again with the idea of 14 being a significant number. When you take the numbers that correspond with the letters of David's name, they add up to 14. Um, and 14 is also considered a very significant number because it's 14 is two sevens, and seven is considered a holy number. And
Right.
so,
Going back to the numerology that you talked about doing in a future sermon. Yeah.
exactly, which I'm probably gonna, bring back again when I do that particular message.
Well, good. 'Cause I learn better by repetition, so keep bringing it back.
I will do that.
Just the numbers.
Well, I just know how, so often names were spelled differently. And, so, and names and first names were repeated very commonly. And so trying to sort all of that out, how were records kept between, how far 14 generations back and up, did they know that they were going to be needing these records?
Probably not.
So were they really kept that way? Did they really keep records like that? How did you know?
Probably not. And so that begs the question, how were they kept? I don't know. I mean, obviously somebody had to have kept them. Or they were probably kept in the temple, because particularly for the male children, when they came to be dedicated, when they came on the, what was it, on the fifth day or the seventh day after their birth.
Yeah, something, yeah.
But they had to come and be circumcised. And so, and there it was indicated, that's where all of the genealogy was kept. And so, ultimately that's probably where it was all, documented. But your point reminded me, Marley, about how, when I was deep into doing my mother's genealogy on my mother's side of the family, I came across a set of children, for one particular, like a grand uncle or a great grand uncle or something like that. And his children, there was, I don't know, Benjamin and whatever, whatever all the names were. And then I found those all in one census. And then in another census, I found the same list of names in the same order, but with different birth dates.
Hmm.
And I couldn't figure it out for the longest time until I discovered that this man, who was one of my mother's ancestors, had married a woman, and they had had all these kids. And they named them, there was a generally accepted naming convention, where, the first male child was named after the father, and the first female child was named after the mother, or whatever. This was in the South, in South Carolina and Georgia. But then what had happened was that woman that he married died. and he married her younger sister.
Hmm.
And then they started having children. And all the children that they had, they kept the same naming convention. So they had literally had two sets of kids with the same names in the same order.
Wow.
And it was just blew me away when I figured that out. It was like, who does that? You know? But back in that time, that was
Mhm.
generally accepted as the procedure. And so, you kind of have to then think about what was generally accepted within
Mhm.
the culture. Of course, you know, for them to have had a genealogy leading to Mary would have been unheard of. They just would not have done that. You just didn't. Partly, I think, because of the status of women
The
in that
women,
time,
yeah.
Yeah.
but also it just was not done. You just your lineage was through your father, and was always through the male, and so that's why I really think it's interesting that Mary's name really never comes up in the Luke lineage. But yet there is that assumption that that particular line, because it does come off of Nathan as opposed to Solomon, and then comes down to Mary, that that would have been her family tree.
It-
We don't know for
It's
sure.
interesting as you talk about that, and yet now I thought that it's through the woman that the mother that the Jewish line continues.
It is your Jewishness, yes, is considered through your mother. That is correct. Now, why there is that difference, I don't know.
So whether you're Jewish or not, it comes through your mother's line, but the important line is your father's line,
Name.
The historical one.
historical line. Okay.
Right.
So the
Okay.
name, okay, Joseph, that's the only name I was ever familiar with. So what was the other father name?
Heli.
Heli, right?
Right.
Heli, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've
Heli.
seen that, but I guess I just didn't realize it was in reference to the father of Jesus.
I don't think that it was, and that's what scholars tend to think, that he was probably more likely Joseph's father-in-law.
Okay.
Which
Okay.
means that Heli would have been Mary's father, which then again solidifies the idea that Jesus was of the line of David. That
Okay.
Through Mary.
Down to Mary.
Okay. And that's what you were, okay.
So you've got both, it's a both and, if I guess if people looked at Matthew's genealogy and said, well, but Joseph wasn't really Jesus's father, so
yeah,
how is it then that Jesus was from the line of David? Well,
with Joe, I've always wondered that myself.
you've got this, this
The
other
tree
that presumably leads us to Mary.
Well, it is possible that they both go back there.
You know what?
Because I mean, again, going back to my modern, what I've been doing, I've been tracing back, and we come from this one person through three of his sons. They all kind of, because of there's so much cousins, and way back in the 1700s, so many cousins would marry and all of that. So we actually go back to this one person through three different sons of his.
Right.
So they could both go back.
When I studied the Jesse tree, and I remember, pretty young, and I thought that was the lineage of Mary, but it's not, right? It's the
No.
lineage of David. So that's what got me confused, thinking, why I just assumed since Mary was more, really more related than to Jesus. Yeah, so that is interesting that they
Right.
worry on the lineage of Joseph, or that they record the lineage of Joseph.
Correct, and that's, again, it's because, and it's interesting also because, Matthew was writing his gospel to a group of Jewish Christians, what we
Right.
would call Jewish Christians. They
Yeah,
were Jews who believed that Jesus was Messiah.
okay.
And so
Okay. That
because
makes- yeah.
Messiah had to have come from the line of David, then they had to show that Jesus was somehow related. And so they've got him,
Yeah.
but they've got this line that comes down to Joseph.
Yeah.
But Joseph was obviously not the biological father of Jesus. So you've got that disconnect there. But then the rationale for that is, well, before Jesus was born, Joseph married Mary. And so because Joseph and Mary were married, officially married to each other by the time Jesus was born. Because,
Legally.
remember you have the story of them going to Bethlehem, and it says that, Joseph went with his wife. She wasn't his betrothed anymore. It was his wife. So they were married. They were officially married, which then means that for all intents and purposes, Jesus was his son
Legally.
from a legal perspective.
Right.
And that's what the Jews would have hung on to, because to them it was, the legality of everything.
Well, and as I said, that's still part of, I know that in some cases, because we ran into this when I was working with pregnant teens, that if the mother is married to someone other than the biological father at the time of birth, that's who she's married to that's on the birth certificate. So it's still present day.
Right.
So when Matthew wrote the gospel, was because like we talked about, well, we don't have to be hung up on a virgin birth, right? So,
Right.
but when Matthew wrote the gospel, that was the belief then, right?
Well,
Yeah,
that's
was that the
Well,
belief system?
when you go back to the original Greek, to the original language, the word that he used could have been translated as virgin.
Yeah.
It could have been translated as young woman.
Mhm.
So it could have been meant either way.
Right. Right.
So the question becomes, was Jesus
Right.
her illegitimate child? Had she indeed fooled around and come up with this story, which, or did Matthew come up with this story? Because actually the story only occurs in his gospel, right?
Yeah.
His gospel. Yeah. Did he come up with it? Because when you look historically at at the different myths, mythology, and different stories that were going around in the different religious traditions, and I don't mean like necessarily Judaism, but some of the more pagan religions, they had, and this would be a really interesting thing to study, I think. They had their stories. They had their own creation stories. They had their own flood stories. They had their own stories about their rulers and the gods and how they were conceived, and how there was all this miraculous stuff that was happening that surrounded all of their their activities, you know? Is it possible that some of this stuff that we have in the Bible was written in response,
Mhm.
you know, to those mythologies, to those different
Yeah.
stories? I think that one could argue that yes,
It's a
they would.
possibility.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that is a possibility.
And there are theologians that do honestly believe that.
Absolutely. If you read anything by pretty much anything by Marcus Borg,
Borg,
you
yeah.
know, yeah,
And
Marcus
given
Borg,
the questions, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And he was a big component of that series.
yes, uh-huh.
Yeah.
You know, there's a whole line of or a whole group of Christians, I think, that you can very easily say, you know, they don't believe in the miracles, they don't believe, or they don't believe that they happened the way that they did,
The
that
way that they, yeah.
there's some other explanation, and that they you know, that part of the Bible is really, you know, not true.
And that's something. And
And
I love the miracles. I was thinking about that last week, Jody, when we talked about, like you were talking, I think Keith asked the question about, somebody knew, whether they're a young adult or teenager or whatever, someone kind of new to Christianity, what books of the Bible to first read,
right,
peruse.
right.
The miracles, I love, and I still love reading all the miracles. I mean, as simple as turning water into wine, and feeding the 5,000, and the nets full of fish. I just and so you're not going to tell, Borg or anybody isn't going to tell me that those that those aren't true. Now, granted, I'm not hung up on the details, but I mean, and my psyche, I have to believe in miracles. I mean, but it's interesting, all the.
That's why I tell people, you know, whether or not I believe in the virgin birth is really between me and God,
Yeah,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
and I'm not gonna tell somebody,
yeah.
oh no, you can't believe in the virgin birth because, you know, yada yada yada. I'm not gonna tell them that. Just like I'm not gonna tell them that the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 didn't.
Little boy,
Mhm.
don't you tell me.
However, think of it this way. What if the feeding of the 5,000 happened like this, where a little boy has, you know, loaves and fish and is willing to share. And
Yeah,
what he does is so inspiring
it's a chain of events. Yeah.
that it
Mhm.
becomes a chain of events, a chain of
Yes.
behavior,
Pass
and
it
everybody
forward.
else shares with each other so that nobody goes hungry and there are still many baskets full of leftovers. Isn't that in itself a
A
miracle?
miracle, yes.
Yeah, and that is cool. And
So
like when I taught that story, that's kind of what we did in Sunday school. We'd each share, bring in something to share.
right.
Yeah.
You know, and even you know, some of the other things too. I mean, it'd be kind of hard to explain away, you know, Jesus walking on water. But I mean, I think there are some of the miracle stories that you could very easily say, you know, well, what if it happened this way? And again, I'm not going to say that it did, nor am I going to say that it didn't. I think that this is part of the interpretive process. The interpretive process is not just accepting the words that are on the page, but instead looking at the words, not only comparing the different gospels to each other, which was what I was trying to do this last Sunday with the whole John the Baptist thing,
Right. That would, yeah.
but to also, you know, look at what do other authors have to say about these different writings. And I think that we have to, if we're going to do our due diligence, we have to look at both those that are more traditionalist, okay, more orthodox, along with the ones that are more progressive. And then after we've done our research, just like you would anything else, say, okay, what makes sense to me? What speaks to me?
Right.
You know, if the miracle stories as a miracle, you know, if the story of the loaves and the fishes, where a little boy brings his food and all of a sudden, you know, there's way more than anybody needed. If that speaks to you, then that's what you should believe. But if the other speaks to you more, then that's what you should believe as well. And so that's what I was trying to, in a very short period of time, trying to show with the story of John the Baptist. You know, you start with Mark, who was very limited in the amount of information that he gave about Jesus and John the Baptist. If you only had Mark, you know, what would you know? You would know that John was a man who lived in the wilderness and baptized people. And when Jesus came along, he baptized Jesus too. Okay? That's all you really know. Then you go to Matthew and you say, okay, what does Matthew have to say? Well, Matthew gives us a little bit more information. And then you go to Luke, and Luke gives us a little bit more information. And in fact, Luke is the one that gives us that one little nugget at the end of chapter 1, where he says that the boy grew up and lived in the wilderness.
Yes.
Like, okay, how did that happen?
Yeah.
Now, how in the original, in this story of Mary and Elizabeth, isn't Elizabeth described as a kinswoman, or what is her relationship to Mary stated as?
So let me pull that up here.
They were cousins, right? Mary went to stay with her. I thought she went to stay with her cousin Elizabeth when she was pregnant.
So in the New International Version, Gabriel says, the angel says to Mary, even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age. So now that's Luke chapter 1.
Okay, so we don't know what relation.
Hold on.
Okay.
Luke chapter 1, verse 36. All right, so I'm going to look up Luke 1:36. There's a website called Bible Hub, and I love it because it gives you it goes verse by verse, and it gives you the different translations, the different English translations, but then you can also look it up in the Greek. So, like I said, in the New International Version, it said, Elizabeth, your relative. Almost all of them say relative. In the King James Bible, it says, behold, thy cousin Elizabeth.
Yeah. See, I heard cousin.
We've got several others that say relative. The Dewey Reams Bible says cousin.
What about Common English Bible?
The Common English says, the Contemporary English says relative. Let me go back to Bible Gateway.
Yeah, that's what I'll use.
And the Common English says, your relative Elizabeth has conceived a son.
So do we don't know the word in the original language.
So if you go back to the Greek, the word relative is syngenous, and syngenous, or Sungenis. 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 Okay, so congenital, akin, a kinsman, a relative,
Yeah.
countryman, fellow, so it's not real specific, but
It's pretty open.
it is a pretty open, pretty
Mhm.
broad-based thing. So we have picked up on them being cousins, probably because the King James version.
So, yeah, translate it that way. So if they were, so to me, it makes sense if we don't know what relation it was. It wasn't like they were first cousin. John and Jesus were first cousins.
Okay.
Obviously, they were further than that.
Yeah.
True, but even so, even if they had been, let's say they were somehow not first cousins, maybe they were or maybe they were once removed or whatever it happens to be. Obviously Elizabeth and Mary had a relationship with each other.
Right.
Yeah.
So it would make sense that if they had a relationship with one another, that made that there's the possibility that whenever Mary would come and their family would come to Jerusalem to go to the temple. I mean, after all, Elizabeth and her and Zechariah lived in the suburbs. It would be very easy for them to go and visit if they made the time to do that. So, I mean, that one could argue that.
Yeah.
But if you look at that verse at the end of Luke, where he's at the end of Luke chapter 1, I think it is, or chapter 2, where it says, the child grew in strength
And
stature and in the wilderness. So why was that? Well, okay, so let's think about this. Elizabeth was of advanced age when she gave birth.
And we don't know when they died, right?
I figured she died, when he was growing up.
Yeah.
Right. So somebody had to raise him. Who would have raised him? Well, it was not unusual for them. We read this even in the Old Testament, where women would have babies and then they would give the babies to the temple to be raised, and the children would be raised by the temple workers, or we wouldn't call them, they wouldn't have called them sons, but the people that had themselves dedicated themselves to the work of the Lord. So this argument that I brought up in the sermon, that he was perhaps raised by a group of Essenes, could make sense, in which case it would almost be like John was adopted out. When kids are adopted out, they don't know necessarily
their family, right?
Biological families are. So
well,
the question of, did they know that they were cousins?
I know. The mess.
And it's interesting, Jody, because there's a couple other thoughts I had. I mean, number one, you made the point that, and I am the same way. I have cousins that I saw quite a bit growing up, but I haven't seen in 40 years, and I mean, I'm a little older, but still they were, Jesus was in his 30s. He could have not seen him in 15 years,
Exactly. I was actually, when I was little, we moved from Indiana to California, where my dad got a job, and which meant that we were separated. All of my mom's family was in South Carolina and Georgia. All of with the exception of one aunt who lived in Wisconsin, all of my dad's family was in Indiana. And when we moved to California, I was 3 years old.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, a couple years ago, my sister decided that she wanted to put together a cousins reunion, which was great. I didn't know any of them, because we had never met. I mean, we knew we were cousins, and then we became Facebook friends, and it was really cool to get to know one another as adults. But as kids, I never knew who my cousins
Right,
were
right.
because we couldn't afford to make a
Yeah,
cross-country trip with a family of 4 or 5 to go back to visit with relatives,
yeah.
except maybe once every 5, 6,
Yeah,
7 years, maybe.
and you don't build a relationship that way.
No.
The other thing that went through my head in that, the other point with that is, you talked in the sermon about John's comment of not knowing Jesus. I didn't know Jesus.
Right.
The thing that ran through my mind with that is the double meaning of the word know.
Yes.
That it's possible, particularly because of the way it said, Jesus came out of Nazareth and nothing good comes out of Nazareth and everything. It even, him saying that, the thought ran through my head, well, maybe he knew him as a relative or something like that, but he didn't know him as God.
Yeah.
Or as the Son of God.
That's
Right.
kind of what I always thought, Marley. I always thought he knew that they were cousins. In my mind, just the way I probably the lack of order I read it in or whatever, but because probably when I read the story, I already had I'd already known the Elizabeth Mary story. I don't know, but I just assumed they knew they were cousins.
I guess the other thing that goes through my mind is, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference to me whether they knew each other or not.
Right.
But it's cool, but yet just the way we are with family, I'd be so proud. I'd be
Right.
proud of Jesus.
Hold on, guys, just for a minute.
I hear you.
And it's fun when our kids do stuff, and it's important to me that the cousins are going to start to get to know each other more.
Oh,
Did I tell you?
Mhm.
hold
Did I
on
tell
just a
you
minute.
my daughter's moving?
You did. You told me.
So they'll be growing up together in Texas.
Yeah.
And because I didn't get some of my cousins I knew for a while, but when I was little, but it was more just going from Pennsylvania to Oklahoma in the summer.
Mhm. Now,
And
fortunately, our cousins, our grandkids in 2 different places, but they do get together fairly
do.
frequently, so they do see each other.
Before COVID, right?
Yes, exactly.
Pre-COVID.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys, that was our cleaner.
Oh,
Oh,
She had a question for me, I figured.
that's okay. We were
She
talking
doesn't call
cousins.
me. Normally, she just text messages me, so I knew that if she was calling, she needed something, so.
something.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, so and part of the reason why I went through the going through each of the gospels that way, the way that I did, was to kind of demonstrate, and hopefully more people picked up on this, but to demonstrate how do we go about studying scripture? How do we go about the interpretive process? Because it's one thing to sit down and to read through the Bible, right? And that's fine. I mean, certainly I would love to hear that people are reading the Bible as opposed to not reading the Bible, right? But we also, if we're going to really fully understand, and like we were saying before, we're going to fully understand and have the Bible make sense to us, we need to do more than just reading the words that are on the page, right? And that might mean doing some comparison work, looking at the different versions, because, and one of the things like you were mentioning, Marley, about how, you take one story about, or how nothing good can come out of Nazareth, right? Well, a lot of times what we tend to do is we tend to harmonize the 4 gospels together, right? We take the stories that are found in all 4 gospels and we kind of mush them together in our minds. And if you were to quote that particular story, I wouldn't necessarily know where it came
Which
from, except
gospel,
that I know
yeah.
that it comes, from whichever gospel it comes from, because we have this tendency to kind of mush them all together. But what's more interesting when we really get down to studying the Bible, and particularly when we're studying different passages in the script, in the Gospels, is the interesting way that we can, or how we gain so much more depth when we look at how each of those stories was told by the different
Mhm.
authors, right? And I know I'm preaching a little bit to the choir here, but I'm hoping that somebody who watches this will also get something out of that as well.
Jody, I'm gonna back up and I'm gonna add a question to your questions list.
Oh, good.
And I don't know if it's so much a question, but I think it would be, to me, I've thought about this for a while, that it would be interesting to look at, for example, the different creation stories across different religions, or whatever. And because I know even in the, if you look at the Native American faith and various things, there's creation stories in each of them, and some of the other things, and look at the similarities,
Right.
Traces, yeah.
different ones. I think that would be fascinating to see how much similarity and difference there is in those.
Would there be a good book on that? A good resource for creation across the religions or something?
I'm sure there probably is. I don't know that I know one. I don't know that I have one. But yeah, I think that would be interesting. I'm not sure how well it would play in a message on a
Probably
Sunday
not.
morning. Only because there are people out there who just, say, oh no, this is, like the flood story. Well, we happen to know that there's also the tale of Gilgamesh, which is very similar, and is probably where the Noah story came from.
Okay.
And so, then you have the argument, well, if, which came first, and which one is real, and yada, yada, yada. It's like, well, it really doesn't, again, it doesn't really matter. No.
And the charge of being sacrilegious, or
Right. But I do think that would be a very interesting thing to do, maybe in like a, maybe like a several week Bible study of looking at the different. I like that idea. I do like that idea. That'd be kind of interesting.
Yeah. Not only the creation, but all the different similar stories across.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and they also have, getting back to the idea of the Gospels, there are parallel Bible or parallel Gospel books. I have several of them where they've gone through and they've compared the different stories in the Gospels to each other, and those are really good, particularly if you're trying to do like what I did with the John the Baptist story, is how do these different stories compare to one another. It's called a gospel parallel. And they're really very handy for that purpose. But then beyond that, beyond doing the comparison within the Gospels themselves, is to then go back out and look at what other sources there are that, where these different stories may occur, whether it's different Gospels that are not in the canon, or if there are other books that have been written, or commentaries, or things like that. That's what I find really fascinating, is what is it that other people have written about these things. And that's where I think you gain a lot of insight that way. But it also, for me, it throws up little question marks like, oh, well, I hadn't thought of that, or well, what if it happened in a different way? What would that look like? And so much of, I didn't really hammer this very hard this last Sunday, but so much of what we read in the Bible, particularly in the Gospels, is not very detailed. You know, there are a lot of holes in there. You know, you just, you know, go through and pick a section of any of the Gospels, and you pretty much have, you know, well, Jesus went here and did this, Jesus went here and did that, Jesus went here and did this, and well, what happened in between? You know, what happened to the in between stuff?
Yeah.
And a lot of that is missing, which means that we kind of have to use our imagination,
We do. Yeah.
and that's not a bad thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Not a
Well,
bad.
and to me, in reading any of it, it's okay, what is the message that we are to get from this? What is the meaning of this?
Right. Right.
And that's
I
where I
agree.
like the metaphors and the symbols and the, yeah, you know.
What is the meaning?
lesson.
What are we to learn from this
Yeah,
for ourselves, to apply for ourselves?
yeah.
Exactly.
And that's the reality, you know,
That's what's most important out of it, not some of the
Absolutely.
other
And
details.
if we approach the scriptures, if we approach these stories from that perspective, then we're going to get the most meaning out of them, right? We're going to, we might learn something new, or we might even have what we believe be, you know, solidified. You know, it might be, okay, well, this is what I believe, this is what this person says, this is what everybody else says. Okay, that makes sense. So
It might be solidified or it might be challenged.
it might be, you know, and that's okay.
but
I think it's better when it gets challenged.
Yeah, I mean,
That means
there
that
again, we can't put God in a box. We can't put Jesus.
cannot put God in a box. That's right. And the other, you know, and John Wesley would never have us put God in a box. You know, John Wesley would always say that we need to, you know, use our brains and question and you know, just dig until we finally feel like maybe we've gotten to the root of the answer.
Yeah.
So.